Okay, worldwide flood, then the post-flood point toward creationism. Now we look at the lowering of the temperature of the polar latitudes. Dramatic. Why did that? It was lowered. Why was it so dramatic? Does that point to evolution or the worldwide flood creationism, recent creation? Take a look at that. We were at K41 here, BibleStudyManuals.net. We look at the lowering temperatures. Let's see. Polar latitudes. Sometimes you do well, if you misspell it, you're not going to get it. Latitudes. There we go. Well, we're already here. There's only one T. Okay. Well, make sure you type in the one T. The lowering of the temperature of the polar latitudes. Now, this is evidence of an ice age, which points to a recent catastrophic worldwide flood. The lowering of the temperature of the polar latitudes as the canopy. It's an ice canopy, really, not a vapor canopy. That's the only way. You can look that up. We've talked about this before. The vapor canopy would have blocked the sun from coming in. An ice canopy would have been translucent and protective of the Earth, giving it 30% more oxygen. Anyway, the ice canopy, precipitated, would have immediate and important climatologic reactions. Big words here. However, the initially warm temperature of the water in the polar seas, together with its continuing turbulent state, sufficed to prevent its freezing from a period of unknown but substantial duration. So for a while there, it didn't lower. Undoubtedly, the first water actually to freeze would have been that mixed in with the sediments being deposited in these regions, cut off, as it were, from the warmer temperatures and the turbulent agitation of the free water in the open seas. Once it started to become stagnant and subjected to colder temperatures, it would freeze first. Thus, must have been formed at some intermediate or late stage in the Deluge period, those vast stretches of permanently frozen soils in the Arctic and subarctic known as permafrost. Embedded in these frozen mucks of the Arctic are large numbers of fossil mammals, fairly deep, apparently trapped and in some cases partially frozen before the soft parts had decayed. Those fossil mammals testified to a warmer temperature, and all of a sudden they got frozen to death. The extensive silty alluvium, now frozen in central Alaska, contains numerous mammal fauna. Freezing has preserved the skin and tissue of some of the mammals. The fauna list includes 2 bears, dire wolf, fox, badger, wolverine, saber-toothed cat, jaguar, lynx, woolly mammoth, mastodon, 2 horses, camels, saiga, antelope, 4 bisons, caribou, moose, stag moose, elk, innumerable, 2 sheep, muskox, and yak, and the types of ground sloth, and several rodents. The number of individuals is so great the assemblage as a whole must represent a rather long time. Huge variety. Where are they now? How come they don't see something way back in the past? These animals existed there. That these mammals and the freezing of the alluvium now containing them represents a rather sharp change of climate is quite obvious. Excuse me. The time of inception of permafrost remains nevertheless unknown. The fossil record, according to the evolutionists, supposedly implies that in earlier Cenozoic time there could have been no permafrost in the Arctic region. The areas of former ice sheet bears no evidence relation to the distribution of permafrost. Charlesworth says vast herds of mammoths and other animals, the New Siberian Islands in the far north of Asia, have yielded mammoth, woolly rhinoceros, musk ox, saiga, antelope, reindeer, tiger, Arctic fox, glutton, bear, and horse among 66 animal species required forests, meadows, steppes for their sustenance. It could not have lived in a climate like the present, with its icy winds, snowy winters, frozen ground, and tundra moss the year round. So this doesn't support evolution. The Quaternary Era, Larry Vardaman states in his article entitled Cooling of the Ocean After the Flood in the Impact Brochure 277. If all the hills that were under the whole heaven were covered by the flood and all flesh died that moved upon the earth, as described in Genesis 7:19 and 21, then it is likely that the massive global upheavals of the crust and oceans were involved. If the geologic column is a record of catastrophic events of the flood over a period of about a year, some 5,000 years ago, the large quantities of heat would have been released from frictional forces of erosion and from crustal motions such as continental breakup, plate subduction, and earthquakes. Because the oceans would have been in direct contact with many of the sources of heat, the water would have been warmed and remained so for some time during the flood, following the flood. This is the post-flood period. Record of heat in the sediments. Layers of sediment averaging over 1,000 feet thick cover the seawall all over the earth. Samples of these sediments have been extracted by deep-sea drilling techniques, which have led to a better understanding of Earth history. Sea floor sediments not only contain sand and mud eroded from the continents, but also shells of microorganisms which lived and died in the ocean. Some of these microorganisms, called foraminifera, incorporate varying quantities of oxygen isotopes in their shells as the temperature changes, allowing them to be used as like a paleothermometer, an instrument for estimating temperature in the past. McKennett and others have analyzed the concentration of oxygen isotopes and these foraminifera, which live on the sea floor near the Antarctic, using a conventional timescale which assumes that the seafloor sediments have accumulated over millions of years at a rate similar to that observed today, which is a big assumption. They found a slow decrease in temperature of about 20 degrees centigrade since the end of the Cretaceous period, when the dinosaurs lived, was so warm. However, if these same data are interpreted from a young Earth catastrophic flood perspective, let's see what that information might make plausible. An entirely different result is found. Using a biblical timescale, which assumes that the seafloor sediments have accumulated mostly over a few thousand years during and following the Genesis flood, initially at a very high rate and decreasing exponentially to that observed today, Vardaman found a rapid decrease in temperature immediately after the flood, followed by a slower decrease with time. Most of this cooling to have only taken about 2,000 years to reach temperatures commonly observed today. Much more rapidly, not millions of years, but only thousands. The shape of the cooling curve is similar to that expected by a body starting at a high temperature and cooling by heat transfer to a cooler reservoir. The rate of cooling is rapid initially, but slows with time, approaching the final temperature asymptotically, in other words, in a relatively straight line. During the steep portion of the cooling curve, the climate of the Earth would be expected to change dramatically as the oceans cool by some 20 degrees centigrade today. Now today, when the ocean's surface averages only 1 or 2 degrees warmer than during an El Nino event, major changes occur in circulation and precipitation pattern over the Pacific Ocean, leading to major storms and flooding on the west coast of North and South America. How much more dramatic would climate change be for 20 degrees centigrade cooling? So we have implications of a cooling ocean. If the model of the seafloor sediment accumulation described above is correct, the implications are dramatic. Most of the sediments found on the seafloor were deposited rapidly just a few thousand years ago. The rate of accumulation would have been very rapid during and immediately following the flood. Not only erosion of sands and muds from the continents would have been involved, but also the accumulation of microscopic plant and animal organisms from the ocean itself. This would indicate that the tiny organisms in the ocean probably bloomed following the flood due to all the nutrients added by the flood and the greater warmth. as well as fewer large predators, without allowing a continued rapid doubling of biomass. The warm ocean would have produced at least 4 significant atmospheric effects. Much greater evaporation of water vapor from the ocean to the atmosphere would have led to a greater storminess and precipitation, particularly in the polar regions. Large temperature contrasts between the oceans and continents would have produced strong winds and heavy precipitation parallel to coastlines. The blooming of ocean life following the flood would likely have absorbed large quantities of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, causing radiational cooling. Warm oceans and radiational cooling aloft would create more convection in the atmosphere, leading to more precipitation. Get it? The atmospheric effects appear to be an adequate explanation for the Ice Age, which produced more extensive glaciers than today, and massive sheets of ice over large areas of the polar regions and mid-latitudes. The Ice Age in the biblical time frame probably lasted from shortly after the flood to about the time of Abraham. The Ice Age probably affects the peoples of the Bible with a cooler, wetter climate and more grasslands in the Tigris-Euphrates Valley, Palestine, and North Africa. These regions are known for their desert climate today, but evidence points to more vegetation in the past. Okay? Once the oceans cooled to the equilibrium temperatures of today, the climate reached a stable condition with only relatively minor variations. Generally, the world's climate would be expected to be drier or less moisture was transported into the atmosphere from a cooler ocean. Winds along continental boundaries weakened, less carbon dioxide was removed from the atmosphere, leading to warmer atmospheric temperatures, and convection decreased. Variations in climate would be primarily produced by seasonal changes rather than highly energetic storms and the cooling of the ocean. So we have conclusions and recommendations. Rapid accumulation of seafloor sediments during and following the flood imply that the ocean cooled rapidly over the past few thousand years. This rapid cooling explains the cause of the Ice Age and other climate changes. Rather than being a puzzle for young Earth creationists, thick layers of sediment on the seafloor and massive sheets of ice on the continents appear to be a consequence of the catastrophic events of the Genesis flood, the worldwide flood. Once again, biblical accounts of Earth history are being confirmed, lending credibility to God's Word. It is recommended that the young Earth model of seafloor sediment accumulation proposed here be improved by analyzing the oxygen and carbon isotopes from many additional cores. The identification of the flood, post-flood boundary needs to have a high priority. An analysis of the productivity of sediments containing shells of living organisms in a post-flood ocean should be made and compared with the mass of sediments observed. The accumulation of hundreds of feet of sediment on the average and miles of sediment in some locations, such as the Arctic Ocean, require very high productivity following the flood. Although the potential for high productivity has been suggested by some, can the ocean supply enough nutrients in some 4,500 years to explain the observed sediments? You got lots of research done here by these people. For example, a footnote: the richness of the Siberian mammoth deposits in the permafrost defies description, although uniformitarian writers consistently understate the extent and abundance of these beds. Even their admissions are significant. In this connection, the extinction of the woolly mammoth in northern Eurasia should be mentioned. In Siberia alone, some 50,000 mammoth tusks have been collected and sold to the ivory trade, and there are rare occurrences of whole animals preserved in frozen ground. These finds have fostered many tales of great catastrophes for which there is no factual support. Perhaps a little less restrained estimation of the character of these deposits may be gleaned from the following. A certain amount of ivory is furnished by the vast stores of remains of prehistoric animals still existing throughout Russia, principally in Siberia, in the neighborhood of the Lena and other rivers discharging into the Arctic Ocean. The mammoth and mastodon seem to at one time to have been common over the whole surface of the globe. In England, tusks have been dug up, for instance, at Dungeness as long as 12 feet and weighing 200 pounds. More on this.